Okay, let me welcome everyone to today's session. First, let me welcome our speaker, Dr. Omar AlShehabi. He is a visiting senior research fellow to the Middle East Institute. It has been a great pleasure to have him with us. Not a long enough period, I think, but hopefully we'll see more of him in the future. Omar is currently the director of the Gulf Center for Development Policies, and he is an assistant professor in economics at the Gulf University for Science and Technology in Kuwait. He's previously worked at the IMF, the World Bank, and McKinsey, and his research focuses primarily on the political economy and modern history of the Gulf Arab states. Today, what he's going to talk about, and if you look at today's heading, you'll see that it says lineages of sectarianism, nationalism, and absolutism in Bahrain. So we're going to focus on Bahrain in today's talk. Omar has actually written a very interesting piece, and I think his plan is to actually expand this into a book. Not terribly long, I think, but he's hoping to expand this into a book. So I hope that will generate a lot of discussion today. Please feel free to challenge Omar. I think he's up for it. And he will talk primarily about, and I've gone through the paper that he had earlier published, and three key things which we will hear about today. One, he will argue that political mobilization is a modernist product. Two, he will give you a new reading of what has happened historically in Bahrain, looking at two concepts. One is the colonial ethnosectarian gaze, and the second is the concept of contested and divided rule. What I found very interesting about the piece that he had circulated internally, and it is available publicly as well, is that he looks not just at the British archives, but he also looks at local literature. And that gives you a very interesting perspective, not always the same perspective as you would have seen as recorded in the British archives. Finally, he does give you some ethnographic examples, so it better illustrates, I think, the impact of both these concepts. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about what Omar's going to talk about. I'm going to now hand the mic to Omar and let him start the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today, and I look forward to a good discussion. And thank you, Michelle, for the great presentation. And also, first of all, I'd just like to give a quick thank you to the MEI and NUS for hosting me this summer. It's unfortunately been too short, only 6 weeks. And when I first said to many people back home in Bahrain that I'm coming here, they raised their eyebrows. You're like, so you're spending your summer from one hot and small and humid island in another small, hot and humid island. But I'm very grateful that I've come, and I think you have a great institute here, and I look forward to further cooperation. So I think, as Michelle said, my talk today will be looking at relooking the roots of sectarianism and nationalism and absolutism or absolutist rule in Bahrain. So I think probably most of you, whenever you read a news article on Bahrain today, it'll probably, the opening sentence or the opening paragraph will open as something saying, Shiite majority ruled by a Sunni minority monarchy. And probably you will read similar headlines whenever you look at any other Gulf countries, but specifically Bahrain. So, and usually the discussions in these papers and news articles are also based on that. So the groupings are usually Sunnis and Shiites, and they're kind of, fighting each other. So, I mean, I decided to take on this topic, although I'm a political economist, so I usually deal more with material production, etc. But for me, it became a thing to take on because this kind of analysis did not, fit well with my own experience, being someone from Bahrain. And also I felt like the literature, even the academic literature that deals with this subject on the Gulf, has A, not been much, and B, what is there is pretty basic. and generally uses what I call this colonial ethnosectarian gaze, which I'll be talking a bit more about. So let me start. So I think those are the two things that I'll probably focus on today. So one is to try to look at the roots of ethnosectarianism in Bahrain, and then also with that, also the rise of nationalism and the nationalist movements in Bahrain that came up with this, that actually had a very clear anti-sectarianism or trans-sectarianism parts to it. So I'll try to look at those two together. So let me start first with the sectarianism part, or the ethnosectarianism as we call it. And what do I mean when I say ethnosectarianism? Just very basically, I'm talking about political mobilization based on ethnosectarian identities. That the main way that people mobilize and identify themselves politically is based on their sect or ethnicity. So that's what I mean when I'm just going to say ethnosectarianism, or for shorthand, just sectarianism. Okay. So Bahrain is probably unique in the Gulf in that it's had bouts of sectarianism or ethnosectarian mobilization periodically, and I would argue much more entrenched than the other countries in the Gulf. So we've had ethnosectarian mobilization in Bahrain pretty much starting from the early 20th century. So from 1900 to 1920, which I will focus on today, there was a lot of ethnosectarian mobilization. Then it also reoccurred in the 1930s, and then reoccurred in the 1950s, and then also reoccurred at a smaller level in the 1960s, but then obviously after, I guess, the rise of Islamist movements as well throughout the region, it really took on another turn as well in the 1980s and the 1990s and up until today, obviously. So the first question that came to me was, why did Bahrain have this compared to other places in the Gulf? Now, I mean, this might, be some new for some people, but actually, if you compare it to other places in the Gulf, and probably the two most apt places for comparison would be Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, or at least the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, where there is a similar ethno-sectarian demographic makeup. Those two countries have not had a similar history of ethno-sectarian mobilization. In fact, ethno-sectarian mobilization in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia you really cannot trace it up until basically from 1979, basically till the revolution in Iran, and also the overtaking of the Haram in Saudi Arabia by Juhayman. Before that, you don't really find ethno-sectarian mobilization in either Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. But you find it a lot in Bahrain. So that was the first question that came to me, was why is that the case? So, the usual reasons given do not make sense. So one reason is that Bahrain, because there was a conquest by the ruling family there, so the ruling family in Bahrain is AlKhalifa, and they're Sunni, and they came to a country which had a sizable Shia population in 1783. So that's the one reason usually given. But that's, for example, would also apply to Saudi Arabia. So why wasn't there similar ethno-sectarian mobilization in Saudi compared to at least the eastern province of Saudi Arabia compared to Bahrain? So that argument on its own, I think, doesn't hold. Another argument could be that majoritarianism. So some people make the argument that this is a Shia majority ruled by a Sunni minority. That also I don't think holds, because you could make a similar argument about the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. And B, as we will see, when this first started, the British, when they first came and they did the first the first population census, they actually, according to their numbers, found out that Sunnis were a majority in Bahrain, which also, goes against the normal grain. I mean, we can debate the numbers, etc., but it seems a majoritarian argument would also face issues in that respect. Now, so this one factor, I think, which led me to this direction was that Bahrain, unlike Kuwait and unlike Saudi Arabia, and in fact, unlike probably any of the other Gulf countries, with the exception of Oman, and from 1960s onward, had a very strong British colonial presence. So Bahrain, in the period from 1900 till 1956, by far had the strongest British colonial presence of any of the Gulf countries. basically, especially in the period we're looking at, from 1900 up until 1923, the British ended up running the place. As you'll see in the climax of our story, they ended up deposing the ruler and putting in a different ruler and putting in a British advisor who pretty much, he was like Raffles, basically. If I'm gonna give a comparison, he basically ran the place for the period from 1926 to 1957. So that led me to thinking, okay, well, let's look at that. That might be one important reason to look at. And the other, I think, factor that kind of combined with this and interacted would be that there was a significant overlap, but not a complete overlap, between sect, class, and life experiences and geography for a significant part of the population of Bahrain. So as we will look, I'll explain this a bit more, but for a part of the population in Bahrain, there was definitely an overlap in terms of where they lived, their geography, and their sect, and also the kind of experience they had with the ruling family. So I think these two, when combined together, made this argument. And I mean, so I'm going to start with this idea of the colonial ethnosectarian gaze. So I'm not talking here, it's not simply a matter of divide and rule. I'm not just saying, you know, it's not your usual idea of it being divided and rule, and that's how the British used it. The argument I'm trying to make is basically that the British, when they came into Bahrain in 1900, they basically needed a way to kind of classify and rule the place. This for them was, for now, it became an important area that they wanted to expand their influence. And they basically decided, okay, we need a way, how are we going to read this place? So if you imagine they wanted to create a map of Bahrain, and they wanted to kind of, how am I going to read the place? The map, the key codes of this map were ethnicities and sects. So this is what I mean when I say ethnosectarian gaze, that they basically, when they were looking at the place and reading it, they basically divided up the place according to ethnicities and sects. And that's how they mainly read the place, how they ordered the place, and how they made the place legible for them as a place to rule, to code, to order, and to classify. So let me just give you an example here. So this, I don't know if you can see it or not, but this is can I zoom on this thing, or can I zoom on it? I cannot zoom on it. Okay, so this is basically the first census that was done by the British in Bahrain. It's in 1908. This is from what's called Lorimer's Gazetteer. It's probably the most famous reference on the Gulf. It was compiled by a British guy called Lorimer, who basically spent about 4 years traveling around the areas of the Gulf, and he compiled volumes, basically. I think in total there are about 20-something volumes of thousands of pages, where they, in a very colonial British way, methodically documented everything they could about the place. So this is on the part on Bahrain, and you could tell Bahrain was a focus for them at that point because of how detailed it was. Bahrain was the only place they did kind of a full census. So it's much more detailed than the rest. And immediately you can tell that the first, the categorizations they used was basically Shia Sunni. This was the big kind of block division that they used. So for them, they basically looked, and I mean, if we can read it here, I don't know if we could, but, okay, so this sentence basically says, of the whole population of about 100,000, some 60,000, chiefly townsmen, are Sunnis, and about 40,000, mostly villagers, are Shia. So that's kind of the big kind of division that they were. Now after that, they were like, as usual, as they have done elsewhere, the way they started reading the other divisions within this was basically what the British were used to were tribes. So as we can see, for a lot of tribes, they gave a lot of detail. So this goes on for pages, So they went into different tribes, even if the tribes only numbered like 60 people, they put them down. Okay, so this was kind of their reading was through tribes. But then they kind of faced an issue when they got to two different ethnic groupings. One was what's called the Hawala, and the other are what are called nowadays are Baharna. So those are two big ethnic divisions that you'll find in Bahrain that they weren't really, they weren't organized as tribes. So for them, this created an issue. They were like, okay, how do we categorize these? So once you see the different kind of each tribe has very specific numbers and divisions. Then you get to Hawla, and there is no division. It's just a big blob. It's a big blob, and it's the biggest grouping of 3,080 houses in Muharrak in one island. So this for them was a big blob of Hawla, and then there was another big blob of Baharna. Now, just to give you an idea of what these two are. So the Hawla are basically considered nowadays, they would self-identify as people who have extensive familial and cultural connections with both sides of the Gulf. So both on the eastern coast of the Gulf and on the western coast of the Gulf. Now, across time, and they would self-identify as Arab, but this has also been a product of contestation. So over time, they've been called Persianized Arab, Arabized Persians, Arabs, Persians, you will see. In fact, you will see that the British kept calling them different things. Sometimes they call them Arabs, sometimes they call them Persians, etc. But their defining factor was that also sect-wise, they were Sunni. So that's basically the Hawla. The other group that the British as I mentioned, was the Baharna. Now, the Baharna today would self-identify as Shia Arabs who find their lineages in the agricultural villages of Bahrain. So they're basically Shia Arabs who come from the villages fishing and agricultural villages of Bahrain. And similar to the Hawla, for the British, they were also considered as an ethnic grouping. So basically the British divided it this way: Shia Sunni sects, then under the Sunnis there were tribes, Arab tribes, and the Hawla. Under Shias, within the local population, there were the Baharna. And that's it. Those were the divisions. Now then they added another division, which they basically called foreigners. Now, being called a foreigner back then had strong legal and political implications, which I'll get to. But the biggest group they saw as what were foreigners were basically Persians. And Persians here were classified as, people who would self-identify as coming from Iran, which nowadays would usually be called Ajams in Bahrain, who are mainly Shia. And so those were the foreigners that they self-identified. But obviously today they would not be classified as foreigners. But back in that time, the British classified them as foreigners. So those were the different groupings that the British used. Now, I think it's very important to understand this, or this classification. We need to periodize the kind of time period we're looking at. Okay, so I'm looking here. This was made in 1908. Okay, and the period I'm looking at is basically from 1900 to 1923. And that's a very interesting period because it basically covers, the period that was the height of basically imperialism, what like Eric Hobsbawm calls the age of imperialism, which pretty much ran from the late 19th century up until the First World War. And that was basically when the European kind of colonies expanded considerably, and especially in the Middle East. And then also in this period, what was interesting and had an impact on Bahrain was the decline and fall of two regional empires. So one was the decline and fall of the Ottoman Empire, which ruled places like the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, like Hassa. And the other one was obviously the Qajar Empire, which was in Iran. It was also going through its decline and fall. And obviously in this time period, still the idea of states were not crystallized in this period. Nationalism was nascent, and states were not formed. Now this changed after the First World War, right? So after the First World War, Woodrow Wilson comes along, and this idea that different nation states should rule themselves, and we should all be states that kind of work with each other under the umbrella of whatever you want to call it, a Westphalian system or the United Nations or whatever. So this was in the second period of where we're looking at, which is basically after the First World War onwards, is when this. So I think these kind of factors that I just said are important to keep in mind when we're looking at this. So now before I continue, now I also want to say that this reading, this ethnosectarian kind of reading of politics on the island was not the case, I think, I would argue, before British involvement. And in fact, it was definitely not according to the groupings that the British would have made. So I'm not saying, just to make clear, I'm not saying that sect and ethnicity did not play a role. I definitely am not saying it played a big role socially, it played a big role in basically how things were organized, but definitely it was not the main way that people politically mobilized. And definitely not according to these big groupings that the British imagined of basically, Hawala, Baharna, Sunni, and Shia. It was a much more complicated and dispersed manner. So I mean, just to show that, I'll give a quick rough summary of the history of Bahrain before that. Just to give it a quick flavor that if you were just going to read this history, this political history in ethnosectarian terms, you're not going to get very far. So Bahrain was conquered by AlKhalifa. Whenever I introduce a certain group now, a political actor, I will also give their ethnosectarian affiliation. Now, this is not to re-emphasize this kind of reading. It's just to show that actually, if you're going to read them according to ethnosectarian, it will not make any sense. You will not be able to read this history. So, AlKhalifa are obviously Sunni, tribal. They conquered Bahrain in 1783. They conquered it from, before that, they were ruled by a group called Al-Madhkur, who were also Sunni. And Hawala, and who were all under British protection, Persian protection, who are Shia. Now, basically, according to local traditions, there was a local feud that happened between two centers of power in Bahrain, both Shia, both Baharna, and one side reached out to AlKhalifa and was like, look, we'll support you if you come and overtake Bahrain, to kind of, just if you overtake this other group. So AlKhalifa came over after a fight with Al-Madhkur, and pretty much without, there was a bit of a fight, but not much. Relatively, it wasn't a big fight. They were able to overtake Bahrain. So it was relatively not a very bloody takeover because they had some local support. And in fact, for the first few decades of their rule, for example, the first ruler of Bahrain was not really stationed in Bahrain. He relied on local people who were mainly Shia scribes and poets and court writers to administer the island on his behalf. So it is immediately clear that if we just take a purely ethnosectarian reading, it's not going to get us very far in explaining these different alliances. In fact, usually what is usually used more is this idea of the politics of protection. So what is the politics of protection? That if we look at this period, on the external front at least, AlKhalifa were basically like the others in the region. Their political alliances were basically based on which other bigger power in the region can offer them protection from other powers. So as you would see, their political alliances would switch the whole time. So sometimes they'd make an alliance with Al Saud, which is number 4 there. And they'd fight with them a lot too. So Al Saud actually overtook Bahrain for about 2 to 3 years during the first period of Al-Khalifa's rule. They actually kicked out the ruler, and held him hostage and under imprisonment in Saudi for a while. Then it was also with Muscat, with the British. They tried to get a lot of protection from them as well. So, I'm just showing this to say that a purely ethnosectarian reading will not get you very far. In fact, one could say that what mainly marked this period was the rise, for the first part was basically the politics of protection, and an internal civil war between the members of Al-Khalifa. There was a big internal civil war in Bahrain from 1830s to 1840s. Between the members of Al-Khalifa. And this civil war basically ended when the British came, because the civil war was reaching regionally. So the British in the 1860s came over and was like, that's it, you're destabilizing the whole region. They overthrew a ruler or deposed the ruler and installed someone else in 1869. And that basically started another period in this period before heavy British involvement, where this is what, usually in the world, if we're going to take a global perspective, is called the age of capital. And this was for Bahrain a boom period. This was the biggest boom period seen in Bahrain for a while, and it was based on what? It was based on pearl trade. So Bahrain became the center for pearl trade in the Gulf, and in fact the world really. And this was basically based on the expansion of industrial production in Europe, and there was a huge demand for pearls. now created by the rich, and the rich and powerful in Europe wanted pearls. And what was considered the best pearls were those that come from the Gulf, and this was centered, the production of pearls were centered around Bahrain. So Bahrain was basically, its economy was divided according to this. So there were three centers of, let's say, economic lives. One was pearl production, which was centered around an island called Muharrak. Then there was basically trade, which resulted from this pearl production. So whatever money came from selling pearls was used to do trade. And this was centered around Manama. And then there was a third type of economic life, which was based on agricultural and fishing. Now, this is where the part that comes in, where I would say that there was strong overlap between sect, class, and life experience for one part of the population. So now, if we're going to read these economic production through an ethnosectarian gaze, we would see that most, but not all, of pearl producers were Sunni, but there were some Shias. And then if we look at the agricultural part of things, the agricultural villages, the rural part, pretty much nearly exclusively they were all Shia. So the villages and agricultural parts of Bahrain were nearly exclusively all Shia. Majority, but not all, of the pearl divers were Sunni. Now both lives, as an economic life, were terrible. If you were a pearl diver, I mean, you could read books on it. Much of it has been written. It's a terrible life. You were in debt all your life. You would inherit this debt to your son. So if you had debt that you didn't pay, your son would inherit it, and he would have to pay it to the head of the ship. And you'd have to die from the age of 9, and more than half ended up being blind. And it was a terrible life as a pearl diver, just physically. Similarly, as an agriculturalist, maybe physically it wasn't as bad, but you still were subjected to corvée and forced labor. So it was kind of a feudalist structure. The difference, though, was that the kind of, if you want to call it repression, the economic repression that pearl divers were subjected to were by the ship owners, by the pearl merchants or the ship merchants. It wasn't by the ruling family. In fact, the ruling family let the pearl business do their own thing. They didn't really interfere. And in fact, when there was too much injustice, usually the pearl divers would go to the royal family asking, look, help us out here against these greedy ship owners. But it wasn't the case. But it was different in the agricultural villages. So the agricultural villages, they were under the fiefdoms of different sheikhs. So they were distributed between different sheikhs of the ruling family. So this here created a direct line of repression between those in the agricultural villages and the ruling family, while it was not the case with pearl divers. So I think this is very important to keep in mind while we continue across our discussion. So now we come to the British entering in Bahrain. So as I said, the British before, like the rest of the Gulf, were not really interested in internal affairs. They mainly were interested that the region is kept stable for the trade with India. And they signed a lot of different treaties with the different rulers in that period according to this. This changed in the 1890s. So in the 1890s, again, as we said, imperial rivalry was at its height. Britain was worried about what the Germans will do, what the Russians will do, and they wanted to kind of consolidate their position in India. So Lord Curzon, which was the head of the British Raj, I guess, in India, the Viceroy of India, as he's called, in this period decided we need to move forward in the Gulf. It's called the forward policy, that we need to be much more present on the ground in the Gulf so that we can overlook things there. So in the 1897, 1898, they decided we're going to send a British, quote, white officer to Bahrain to oversee things there. So they sent their first, what they called, assistant political agent to Bahrain in 1900. And this was the beginning of the direct involvement of the British in Bahrain. So in 1900, they sent the first assistant political agent. In 1904, they sent a full political agent. And in that year, things started to kick off. So what happened is basically, in 1904, an incident happened that looked pretty trifling, I don't know what's the word, trifling, to begin with. But from the British, it pushed all their buttons that they were looking for in Bahrain. So the British came to Manama. Manama is the capital, the trading capital of Bahrain. So they were based there, while the ruler was based in Muharraq, which is the pearling capital. So if you think of the two cities in Bahrain, Manama is the trading capital, Muharraq is the pearling capital. The ruler was based in Muharraq. The British sent their political agent to Manama. But there was an emir there. So there was also one from the ruling family who was sent there. So the emir of Manama got into a fight with a German, with workers with a German trader there. So the British ended up basically kicking him out, burning down his house, throwing out all of his stuff, and burning down all of his ships publicly. So this was a way basically for them to say, look, there is a new ruler in town, and we're the ones who are gonna be looking over, overlooking things now. Now this was significant not just for that. This was significant for another reason, and this is the other kind of theoretical concept that I try to introduce here, which I call contested and divided rule, which I take from an academic called Mary Lewis. I'd recommend you guys, if you want to read, the book is really good. It's called Divided Rule. I kind of modify the concept to be contested and divided rule. And this is what, when the British came in 1904, after they kicked out the Emir of Manama, they said, okay, this is what's going to happen now. We are going to take over jurisdiction of foreigners in Bahrain. So if you're a foreigner, you are under British rule. British laws apply to you, and the British political agent is the one in charge of you. While if you're a local, you're under the local emir. Now, the problem with this is what, so you had basically two sources of sovereignty, of jurisdiction. But the problem with this was that this is in 1904. There was no concept of nationality back in Bahrain back then. There was no state. You know? So basically the idea came, what defines a foreigner? What defines a local? So the British, what they said was, anyone who is traced to a government that is not from Bahrain is under British rule. So if you're considered to be Ottoman, or from Iraq, or from Iran, or from Najd in Saudi Arabia, you're considered foreign and under British rule. Now the problem is, according to that definition, most people in Bahrain would have at least one connection with someone from from those regions, and if not more. So then these categories, so Najdi, Persian, Baharna, started having significant political and legal influences. I mean, as it happened elsewhere, right? I mean, this is not unique to Bahrain. The British did these classifications in other places. So, you know, whether you were in India, whether you were classified as Hindu or Muslim, meant you had different laws applying to you. In other places, whether you were classified as, you know, Indian or Chinese or etc., you would also mean that you would have different rules applied to you. So this created kind of a contestation in Bahrain. So the ruler would say, no, if you're Najdi, you're under my rule. And the British would say, no, he's under my rule. And people then would start to define themselves in different ways. So if you want to be under local rule, you would tell the ruler, oh, I'm local, I'm under your rule. But then if it's beneficial for you to be under British rule and go to a British court, you'd say, oh, no, I'm Najdi or I'm Persian, so I want to be under British courts. And you could see this happening through this period. There are like scores of different political documents from courts where people would, you know, go to the British court and say, I'm under your protection, but then they would just withdraw the thing and be like, no, I'm going to go to the local court. And so this created contestation on this behalf. And not only that, the British started creating institutions that reflected based on these ethno-sect divisions. So they created the first municipal council in Bahrain, in Manama. And this municipal council was divided formally based on ethnicities and sects. So for example, locals would have 4 seats and foreigners would have 4 seats. And then locals were divided into 2 Sunni seats and 2 Shia seats. The foreigners were similar. The Persian Shias would have 1 seat, the Persian Sunnis would have 1 seat, the Indian Hindus would have 1 seat, and then the Indian Muslims would have another seat. And so this basically enshrined them into it. And then also courts were introduced. So there was the court for foreigners, and then there was a court for locals. And then there was what was called the mixed court, where if there were foreigners and locals combined, they would also go to that. And they also then created a police force that was exclusively staffed by Persians. So we see in this period that not only did the ethnosectarian gaze, the way the British read the situation, they actually started creating institutions that reflected these on the ground, from the courts to the police force to the municipality council. Now, this reached the climax in 1919, after the Second World War, when a new political agent came from England, and these kind of contradictions that were coming exploded. So because you had two centers of sovereignty, one under the local ruler and one under the British, you started seeing groups forming, and a lot of these groups started forming according to ethnosectarian terms. And the two poles they grouped around was, one was pro the local ruler and anti-British, and the other was pro British and anti the local ruler. And these were mainly done according to ethnosectarian terms. Now, I wish I had a Zoom, but unfortunately I don't. So this, for me, is very interesting. Just to give you an example, I mean, I'm not going to go too much into it, but this is just as an example. This is a petition that the political agent in Britain organized. He's the one organized it from local notables to try to kind of get them to, to show support, because people started complaining about him to the British in India. So he wanted to show, actually, I have a lot of support locally. So for me, what's very interesting is the way that he categorized the different groups. So he had two big categories. One was, if you see there, is the one was the Arab community or the local community. Then if you go down, I don't know if you can go down. Oh, no, sorry. So second to the, yeah, and up, more up. Yeah, so he had two basically big groups. One was the Arab community, and then the other one was the foreign community. And then the foreign community was divided into the Persian community, and the Najdi community, and the Indian community. And the local one was divided into the Shia community and the Sunni community. And it's very interesting. You could even see his, if we go to the first page, this first part, you could see even his notation by hand, where he's like, no, insert here Arab community. This is the category I need to be the Arab community. And he makes people identify by their sex. So first he has two religious scholars, and then if we go down, so a lot of notables of the tribes. Let's go down a bit more. Or no, sorry, up to the second one. Then you have basically see someone who starts identifying number 14 as the head of the Shia community, and then this guy starts identifying as the head of the Persian community. Now it's very interesting that the people who were identified as the head of each community were their representatives in the municipality council that the British created. So basically the key to become a representative of your community was the council that was created. Anyway, but what happened during this period is because kind of the contradictions between having two different poles of sovereignty increased so much that they took a violent turn. As we said, there were two poles with different ethno-sectarian groupings that were formed according to each, and they started fighting. So some of the tribes started attacking different Shia villages. In Manama, the Persian community was, started being in fights with the Najdi community. Najd is an area in Saudi Arabia, which was back then was still not formed as Saudi. So Al Saud come from Najd. So there was a big, fight between the Najdi and the Persians, and there were, attacks on villages by different tribes. And basically, as the British described it, these 3 years between 1919 to 1923, so an unusual wave of crime. Now this is interesting because, economically Bahrain went back to booming after the First World War. So it wasn't economic problems. Economy was booming, but the question was, why did this happen? And they basically was this, that people, this ethno-sectarian kind of division of society started interacting with forces on the ground and started having effects on the ground. Now, I unfortunately won't have much time to go through this. At the same time that this was happening, there were also the roots of the first nationalist movement that came in Bahrain. Now this, if you want, one modernity was this one that kind of interacted with British ethnosectarian gaze. The other took its root from Al-Nahdha. I don't know if any of you guys heard Al-Nahdha. So Al-Nahdha is the kind of literary and political renaissance movement that was in the Arab world in the mid-19th century and late 19th century. So in Bahrain, these writings from other parts of the Arab world started reaching by the late 19th century, and then you started getting basically a group of people that formed the first local school in Bahrain. And this became a base for them to kind of start agitating against British rule and starting to kind of read the situation in nationalist term. So you'd see them for the first time using the term Bahraini, which suddenly started coming across as saying, you know, no, we're not going to read each other in ethnosectarian terms, let's read each other as Bahrainis. So this was also the first time, and these came together at the first time, and they were part of the clash. And it's very interesting that all the people that were exiled by the British in this period were the nationalists, which they obviously read in ethnosectarian terms, because most of the nationalists in this period were Sunni. So the British just labeled them, oh, these are tribal Sunnis, and they're causing havoc, so let's send them abroad. Send them on exile from there. So basically the contradictions of this reached a point that in 1923, the British Gulf political resident arrived into Bahrain on a battleship and came to the emir, to the ruler in a very publicized ceremony and deposed him and was like, okay, you can't run this place. For them, it became a collection of unruly ethnicities and sects that was like, okay, we need to pacify this situation. So they came in, deposed the ruler, replaced him with his son, and basically this was again, this is another story that I'm not going to go into, but this was the start of the kind of modernized absolutist rule that you find in Bahrain, or they began the kind of centralization of the state into this modern authoritarianism that we see today. So before that, the kind of rule in Bahrain was very scattered. You didn't have one, monopoly of power. Different sheikhs would have different, their own forces across, and the tribes would have different forces. So the British, after deposing the ruler, they wiped that out, centralized the state, built a modern bureaucracy centered around their new ruler, which was the son of the deposed ruler. But unfortunately, I may be in the discussion, but I can't go into that much into that. But this ethno-sectarian reading of the population continued. So any kind of local opposition movement that would come up over the next 30 to 40 years, the British advisor by this point, who ruled Bahrain for 30 years, with the ruler, who was more a figurehead, would read them in ethno-sectarian terms. And it's interesting if we're looking at it because of today, the way they mainly read it was that the opposition was mainly Sunnis from Muharrak, which is kind of the opposite of what we read today, right, in Bahrain. So it shows you how things and the ethno-sectarian readings could switch around. And the nationalist movements also continued. They grew in strength. Obviously, their zenith, their peak, was the period from the 50s to the 70s, but I unfortunately can't go into that much into this. But I think after that period, it's always important to look at the kind of dynamic, and I think Fanar works on this here, is this dynamic between nationalism, the state, and ethno-sectarianism, because they kind of started going together, because you always would have now references, even by the state, to Bahraini. But at the same time, whenever there's a political movement against the state, they'd read it in ethno-sectarian terms. And the nationalist movements would also start reading things in nationalist and Bahraini, but that's unfortunately a different period than what I want to cover here. So now I'll just sum up. So I mean, really the main reason I wanted to kind of do this is to kind of try to retrace the roots of what happened during this period, because it's usually considered to be the most important in building Bahrain's modern state. And I mean, the main thing, if I wanted to say, and I'll just read it straight from the paper, it is essential to understand that colonialism and nationalism did not arrive as fully formed projects in Bahrain. Thus ethno-sectarianism was not exclusively only a form of colonialist knowledge, nor only a reality which existed in pre-colonial past. It was instead a product of both pre-colonial and colonial factors but one in which the new unfolding colonial order provided the main institutional setting that drove it forward. As was stressed in the study, there was significant overlap in sect, ethnicity, class, and life experiences for many that would have provided strong breeding grounds for ethnosectarian mobilization to thrive locally. Sectarianism is both a colonialist knowledge and a local knowledge that was produced conjointly. The crucial point, however, is this. The distribution of power in this arena was not even, and indeed the arena itself was largely constructed by the colonial power and a system of divided rule and ethnosectarian gaze. The dice was loaded. I'll stop there.
Thank you.